In two houses, on the same grey morning, two people were being told the war was over, and neither of them believed it. At Holmleer, where the rooms had been shut up one by one for want of coal, Verity Wickmere sat at the small table by the cold east window, with her father's chessmen set out before her, and read the letter again, and did not move a piece. The board was the only thing in the room that had not been sold. Ivory and ebony, the white pieces gone the colour of old teeth, the King's Cross worn smooth by 3 generations of Wickmere thumbs, her father's last and dearest possession, and now hers. She had been taught on this board before she could read. She had been taught on this same board the other thing every Wickmere child was taught, which was that the house of Fenwood had ruined them. The Duke's grandfather had cheated her grandfather of a fortune and a name, had taken the Wickmere lands and the Wickmere honour together, and had left them this: a shut-up house, a worn-out board, and a grievance handed down like the entail itself. And now the letter in her hand, in her great-aunt Hortense's spidery hand, told her she was to marry the cheat's grandson to mend it, as though enmity were a torn hem, as though a wedding could unmake 2 generations of cold. She set the letter down. She moved a white pawn, then moved it back. The house breathed its empty winter breath around her. At East Cross, 11 miles off across the frozen common, the Duke of Fenwood read a different letter at a warmer fire, and felt no warmer for it. He was a tall man, auburn-headed, with eyes the colour of slate under rain, and he held himself in his own library like a man on parade, because he had been holding himself so for as long as he could remember, ever since he had understood that his house was the one the county did not quite receive. The Fenwood name was a great one, and a stained one. 2 generations of duchesses had carried it into drawing-rooms that went quiet at the door. His grandfather had been called a cheat in his own lifetime, and had never once defended himself, had borne it in a silence Arthur had never understood, and had been forbidden, as a boy, to question. We do not speak of it. That was the whole of the family catechism. We do not speak of it, and we do not forgive the Wickmeres, who have spent 40 years making sure no one else forgets it either. And now his great-aunt's letter, the same letter in the same spidery hand, told him he was to marry a Wickmere to end it. He could not afford to refuse. That was the bitter arithmetic of it, and he made himself look at it plainly, because he despised a man who would not look at his own accounts. The suit between the houses, the endless grinding suit over the old trust, and the contested acres at Danes Common, had eaten Fenwood for 40 years as surely as it had eaten Holmleer, the lawyers carrying off in fees what neither family any longer had to spare. And there was only one outcome left that did not end in the auction of his grandfather's house. Peace. A settlement. And the price of the settlement, the great-aunt wrote, was a wedding, the joining of the 2 interests in the only way the law could not later pull apart. Marry the Wickmere girl. End it in the one bed where it could not be reopened. He set the letter down. He did not move. The house held its breath around him, the great cold house that everyone believed dishonest, and he sat in the middle of its bad name as he had sat all his life, and thought that he would rather have lost the lands than be handed a wife who had been raised from the cradle to despise him. 2 prides, nursed at 2 cold fires on the same grey morning. Neither of them yet knew the other's face. They met 3 days later at the great-aunt's house, which stood on neutral ground between the two estates, and had stood there deliberately for 50 years, because Hortense Bowthorpe had married into one house and been born a cousin of the other, and had spent her long life as the only bridge across a water both sides pretended had no further shore. She was past 70 now, small and upright, and entirely without softness, and she had summoned them both to her morning room, and seated them at opposite ends of a long table, with the settlement papers laid out between them, like a map of contested country. And she had placed, at the head of the table, where she could watch them both, the family's man of business, Mr. Jocelyn Hatch. Verity disliked him at once, and could not at first have said why. He was a smooth, grey, pleasant man of 60, the solicitor to both houses, the keeper of 40 years of the suit's papers, and he rose and bowed to her with a warmth that did not reach his eyes, and told her, smiling, what an honour it was, what a joy to all who loved both families, to see the long, sad quarrel laid at last to rest. He said it beautifully. He said it as a man says a thing he has said many times and means none of. And under the smooth voice Verity heard, or thought she heard, a thing she could not yet name, a man praising a peace he did not want, the way a miller might praise a drought. The Duke of Fenwood she disliked more easily, because he was easier to read. He rose when she entered, correct to the last degree, and bowed exactly as deeply as her rank required, and not 1 inch deeper, and looked at her with those rain-coloured eyes, as though she were a clause in the settlement he had not yet decided whether to accept. He did not smile. He did not pretend to a warmth he did not feel, which she would have despised, so that she was left irritatingly with nothing to despise except the man himself, who had done nothing yet but be civil. "Miss Wickmere," he said. "Your Grace," she said. And that was the whole of their first conversation, because Hortense began to read the terms, and the terms were a war by other means. Verity listened, and her colour rose, and she kept her hands still in her lap by an act of will. The settlement gave the joined interest to the Fenwood name. Of course it did. The land would be held by the Duke. Her own small estate, Holmlea, the last thing her father had left her, would pass under his hand on the marriage. The contested acres at Danes Common, fought over for 40 years, would be quieted at last by simply belonging, in the end, to him. Peace, the papers called it. She read it differently. She read it as the final move in the long game her family had been losing for 2 generations, the move that took the last Wickmere thing and called the taking a kindness. "No," she said. The room stopped. "I beg your pardon, Miss Wickmere," said Mr. Hatch, smiling. "You have my pardon, Mr. Hatch. You may have it freely, but you will not have my consent to this." She stood, because she could argue better standing, and because she would not be looked down at while she lost the last of her father's land. "I am asked to end a quarrel by surrendering the one thing the quarrel was about. I am asked to call it peace when it is conquest with the lawyer's seal on it. My grandfather, I was taught, was cheated of everything by this gentleman's grandfather. I will not now be cheated of the remainder by the grandson, and be grateful, and wear white. If this is the price of peace, then peace is too dear, and I would sooner the suit ground us both to powder, which at least would be honest, than buy a quiet that costs me everything and him nothing." It was, she knew even as she said it, unanswerable and useless. They had her. A penniless girl with a shut-up house and a county full of creditors did not refuse a duke and a settlement, She had nowhere to refuse him to. She braced for the smooth man's smile, for the great-aunt's sharpness, for the Duke's cold civility to turn at last to the contempt she could then properly hate. But the Duke of Fenwood had set down the paper he held, and was looking at her, and something had changed in the rain-coloured eyes, some small recalculation, as though a piece he had thought a pawn had moved like a knight. "She is right," he said. Now the room stopped a second time, harder. "The terms are unequal," the Duke said, to Hatch, to his great-aunt, to the heir, in the flat, correct voice of a man stating a fact he finds inconvenient. "They give Fenwood everything and Holmley nothing, and call the everything a mercy. I did not read them closely enough. Miss Wickmere has read them more closely than I, and she is right, and I will not sign them as they stand." He looked at Hatch. "Draw them again. Holmlea to remain hers, in her own right, in her own name, marriage or no marriage. Danes Common held jointly, neither house to fence it. If we are to make a peace, Mr. Hatch, let it be a peace between equals, or there is no use making it, for an unequal peace is only a war that has not finished." Verity stood very still, and discovered that she had nothing to say, and discovered that having nothing to say to the Duke of Fenwood was a more unsettling sensation than any contempt could have been. It was Mr. Hatch whose smile had gone just slightly at the edges, as a man's smile goes when an account he had thought closed reopens. "Your Grace is generous," he said. "Perhaps too generous. The original suit, after all, established that the Wickmere claim to the common was always doubtful. To hold it jointly is to give away what the law has half given you already." "Then the law and I disagree," said the Duke. "Redraw it, Mr. Hatch." And Verity, watching the smooth grey man bend reluctantly to his papers, understood the thing she had not been able to name. The peace was a loss to Mr. Jocelyn Hatch. Every fair clause the Duke spoke was a fee Mr. Hatch would never bill. He had drawn the terms to fail, she saw, suddenly and certainly. He had drawn them so unequal that she must refuse, so that the suit would grind on, and the fees would flow, and the Duke had spoiled it by the one move Hatch had not allowed for, which was simple fairness. She revised in that moment, against her will, a thing she had believed her whole life. Not all of it, but one stone of it. The Fenwoods, she had been taught, were cheats to the bone. And here was a Fenwood in front of her, choosing against his own advantage, correcting a settlement in her favour when he need not have, when no one would have blamed him for taking everything she had. It did not make her like him. It made him harder to hate, which is a different and a more troubling thing. The terms were to be redrawn. But there remained, the great-aunt said, the matter of the marriage itself, which the redrawn terms still required, and to which Miss Wickmere had still not consented. And it was here, cornered, with her one small victory, turned at once back into the old trap, that Verity Wickmere said the thing that would undo them both. They had moved to the drawing-room, where Hortense had ordered dinner, and the great-aunt had pressed her, gently and relentlessly, in the way of old women who have decided a thing on the matter of consent. The suit would ruin both houses. The marriage would save them. What possible objection, beyond pride, could a sensible girl maintain? "I will tell you my objection," Verity said. She was tired and cold, and had been losing all day, and the wine had loosened something she usually kept barred. "My objection is that I am to be married to settle a quarrel I did not begin. to a man I do not know, who was raised to despise my name as I was raised to despise his, and that everyone in this room calls that peace and expects me to call it love. I will not. I have been beaten at a great many things in my life, Aunt. I have been beaten by creditors and by lawyers, and by the plain fact of being a woman with a clever head and an empty purse, which the world has no place for. But there is one board on which I have never been beaten, not by my father, who taught me, not by any man who has sat down across from me, thinking a lady would be an easy hour's amusement. So here is my consent, and you may all have it on these terms and no others. She lifted her chin and looked not at the great-aunt, but down the table at the Duke, who had not spoken. I will marry the first man who beats me at chess, the first man who can meet me there, and best me there fairly, with no quarter asked or given, may have my hand and welcome, for he will have proved he sees me as I am, and not as a clause to be signed. And until that man appears, which I do not expect in my lifetime, I will marry no one, duke or commoner, feud or no feud. That is my objection, and that is my answer, and it is the only one I have. It was meant to end the conversation. It was meant as the last word of a proud woman who had run out of every other defense and had fallen back on the one wall no one had ever breached. She expected the great-aunt to call it nonsense. She expected Hatch to smile. She expected the Duke to find it beneath his notice. The Duke of Fenwood set down his glass. "Then send for the board," he said. The board they sent for was not her father's. It was a Fenwood board, a heavy thing of inlaid rosewood that had stood untouched in the great-aunt's library for years. And there was something in seeing the Fenwood pieces set out under the Fenwood candles that stiffened Verity's spine and steadied her hand, because now it was not a parlour game. It was the war, moved to the one field where she had never lost a battle. They played in near silence, the great-aunt watching from her chair, Hatch withdrawn to the shadow by the fire, where Verity could feel him watching too. The Duke played white. He opened conventionally, correctly, a sound, careful game with no flourish in it. The chess, she thought, of a man who had been taught well and had never had cause to be brilliant, and she felt the old contempt return, comfortable as an old coat, and she began to take him apart. She was good. She knew she was good. It was the one thing the world had let her keep, and she had polished it the way another woman might polish a single inherited jewel. She controlled the centre. She made him pay for every careless square. By the 20th move she had the better position, and she let herself believe, for the first time all day, that she would walk out of this house with the only victory available to her, which was to make the Duke of Fenwood admit, in front of his own great-aunt, that the Wickmere girl had beaten him at his own settled table. And then, somewhere past the middle of the game, the Duke's play changed. It did not become brilliant. It became patient. It became, she realized slowly, and with a cold prickle along her arms, the play of a man who had let her think him careless in order to learn how she attacked, and who was now, move by quiet move, closing every door she had thought she had left open. He gave up a knight. She took it, and saw 2 moves too late that she should not have, that the knight had been a question, and her taking it the answer he wanted, and that the answer had cost her the file she needed. He did not press. He never pressed. He simply tightened, square by square, a slow procedural strangling that was somehow more frightening than any dash of genius, until she sat looking at a board on which she had no good move, only a choice of which way to lose. And she understood that she had been beaten, fairly with no quarter, by the one man in England she had sworn the rashest oath of her life to marry, if he did exactly this. She did not tip her king at once. Pride would not let her. She sat with her hand near it, and looked at the wreck of her position, and felt, under the shock and the fury, a thing she had no name for, and did not want, which was the strange wild relief of having been, for the first time in her life, truly met. Then she tipped the king. It fell with a small sound against the rosewood. The room was very quiet. The fire spoke. The great-aunt did not move. And Mr. Jocelyn Hatch, in the shadows, was watching the two of them, with an expression that had nothing pleasant in it at all. The expression of a man who has watched a lock he thought he held the only key to spring open in another's hand. "You let me believe you played carelessly," Verity said. Her voice was steady. She made it be steady. "At the start, you played beneath yourself to study me." "Yes," said the Duke of Fenwood. "That is a kind of deceit." "It is the only kind I will own to," he said, and there was no triumph in him. None, which was the worst of it. He looked, if anything, troubled. A man who had won a thing he was not sure he had wanted to win. "You said no quarter asked or given. I gave you none. I will not pretend I beat you by accident, Miss Wickmere, to spare your pride, because you would despise that more than the losing, and you would be right to." He paused. 1 second. 2. "But I will not hold you to an oath made in anger over a dinner. A foolish word flung at a table is not a contract. Forget that I asked for the board. The marriage stands, or falls on the terms, fairly drawn, and on your free consent, which I would not have on these grounds for the world, and which I release you from entirely." It was, she would think later, the precise wrong thing to say, or the precise right thing. She could never afterward decide which, because it stripped from her the one thing she might have hidden behind, which was being forced. He had handed her oath back to her unenforced. He had refused to be the man who won her by a trick. And in doing so, he had made it impossible for her to tell herself, in the long, cold nights of the winter to come, that anything she felt about Arthur, Duke of Fenwood, was the fault of anyone but herself. That night, in 2 houses, 2 people sat up later than they should have, and neither would have admitted why. At Holmley, Verity unwrapped her father's chessmen and set them out on the cold table and played the game again from memory, every move, her own and his, looking for the place where she had lost it. She could not find a place. There had been no blunder. She had simply been outplayed, slowly and fairly, by a better hand than she had ever sat across, and there was no comfort to be had in the study of a defeat that had been earned. She banked the fire low to save the coal. She sat in the near dark, with the worn white king in her hand, and thought about a man who had refused to win her by a trick, and found she was angrier at him for the refusing than she had ever been at any man for any insult, because an insult she could have hated cleanly, and this she could not hate at all. At East Cross, 11 miles off, the Duke did not set out a board. He sat with the household accounts open and unread before him, and let the fire die in the great cold grate, and thought about a woman who had said at a dinner that chess was the one place the world had left her to be the better at anything, and had said it dressed as a joke so that she could bear to say it. He had heard the thing under the joke as plainly as if she had wept it. He had beaten her. He had wanted, absurdly, to beg her pardon for it, and had not, because to beg her pardon would have been the one insult worse than the winning. He banked his own fire in the end with his own hand, having sent the servants up, a duke kneeling at his own cold hearth in the dark, and went to bed no wiser than he had come down. 2 fires banked low in 2 cold houses, and the same name kept in 2 proud silences, and the snow beginning, that night over both. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The marriage, it was settled, would take place at the end of the winter term, if it took place at all. And in the meantime, because the county must see the 2 houses reconcile, and because the settlement could not be drawn in a week, and because Hortense Bowthorpe had decided it, and Hortense Bowthorpe was not a woman, one undecided, Verity Wickmere would remove to East Cross for the 6 weeks of the term, under her great-aunt's chaperonage, so that the 2 who were to mend the feud might at least learn each other's faces before they were chained for life across a breakfast table. She came to East Cross on the coldest day of the year, in a hired chaise, with 1 box, and her father's chessman wrapped in flannel on her knee. The house received her the way the house received everything, with a grandeur that had gone slightly to frost. It was a beautiful place, and an unhappy one, she saw at once. A great Palladian front looking out over a park the Duke could no longer afford to keep, as it had been kept. The avenues unswept, the fountains dry, the whole proud pile holding itself upright on a bad name and a thinning purse, the way its master held himself upright in his own library. A house, she thought, climbing down stiff with cold, that had spent 40 years being not quite received, and had learned to receive coldly in return. The Duke met her on the steps, correct, bareheaded in the wind, and handed her down himself rather than leave it to a servant, which she had not expected, and showed her the wing that had been made ready for her. Her own rooms, her own maid, a corridor's length, and the whole width of the house between her chamber and his, every propriety, observed and observed pointedly, so that no soul in the county could whisper that the betrothal residence was anything but cold and correct, and chaperoned to the hilt. She understood the care of it. It was for her protection as much as the appearances. He had thought about how the world would speak of her, and arranged the house to give the world nothing to say. She added it, against her will, to the small and growing column of things about the Duke of Fenwood that did not fit the catechism. The great-aunt presided. Hortense had installed herself at East Cross for the term as duenna and referee, and she was, Verity discovered, the only person in either house who said exactly what she meant. She had a tongue like a paring knife, and she used it on both of them with perfect impartiality, and she alone, of all the people caught in the long quarrel, seemed to find the whole thing less a tragedy than a long stupidity that had gone on far past its welcome. You will play chess of an evening, the great-aunt informed them on the first night, because it is the one thing you have both consented to do in the same room without bloodshed, and because I am too old to make conversation for 2 people who would rather be silent. The library is warm. The servants will leave you the fire, and a branch of candles, and the door open, which is propriety enough for 2 betrothed people, and an old woman dozing in the next room. Play. Learn each other's game. It will teach you more than a year of dinners. So they played. It became the shape of the term, the long winter evenings in the library that was the one warm room in the cold house, the board between them on the small table, the great-aunt nodding by the fire with her embroidery untouched in her lap, the door correctly open onto the dark hall. They did not talk much at first. The no quarter of the dinner had set the rule between them, and they kept it. They fought each game out to the last honest move, and the fighting was the conversation. Verity won the second night, and the third. The Duke took the fourth in a long, grinding endgame that ran past midnight, the great-aunt long since sent to bed, and a sleepy footman the only chaperone. And Verity walked back to her cold wing of the house, furious and exhilarated, and unable to say which. She was being met. That was the thing she could not get past, lying awake in the great strange bed in the enemy's house. For 10 years she had sat down across the board, from men who thought a lady's chess a charming novelty, and she had beaten them, everyone, and the beating had been her only revenge on a world that gave a clever woman nothing else, and the revenge had been hollow, because a victory over a fool is no victory at all. And now there sat across from her, every night, a man who was not a fool, who studied her, who made her work for every square, who beat her sometimes and lost to her sometimes, and never once let her win out of courtesy, or beat her with a flourish meant to wound. He played her as an equal. It was the only thing she had ever wanted from anyone, and the world had arranged, with its usual cruelty, for the man to be a Fenwood. She watched him in the day, too, because there was little else to do in a snowbound house, and what she saw kept disordering the catechism. She saw him with his tenants. The Duke rode out most mornings, in any weather, and she went with him once, because the great-aunt suggested she should be seen about the estate, and she watched him stop at a cottage on the bad road past Danes Common, a poor place, the roof half gone, and she heard the man of the house name it a Wickmere holding, one of hers, fallen onto Fenwood's bad road through the accident of the boundary, and she watched the Duke of Fenwood note the broken roof, and say quietly that it would be seen to, that he would send his own men, that a roof was a roof whatever name held the deed under it. He did not know she had heard. He did not do it to be seen. He did it turned away from her, half under his breath, the way a man does a thing that is simply in him to do. A Wickmere tenant, a Fenwood roof, and he had mended the one with the other, and said nothing, and meant her to know nothing. She thought of her grandfather, cheated of everything by this man's grandfather, and she looked at the grandson quietly, arranging to mend a Wickmere roof he had no obligation to touch, and the catechism cracked another inch. And he, for his part, was undergoing the same slow disordering, though he would have died before he named it. The Duke of Fenwood had expected a great many things of the Wickmere girl. He had expected a shrew, or a schemer, or a sulky beauty trading on her grievance. He had been raised to believe the Wickmeres small, spiteful people who had taken his grandfather's silence and built 40 years of public slander on it, who had made the Fenwood name a thing whispered over at dinner, and he had come to the betrothal armoured against a woman he was prepared to find contemptible. He had not been prepared to respect her. But she ran her ruined estate herself, he learned, not through an agent, but with her own hand and head, and ran it well, better than the means allowed, every tenant accounted for, every shilling stretched, a girl of 26, managing a sinking house with a competence that shamed half the men of property in the county. He had not been prepared for the chess, for the cold, clean brilliance of it, for the humbling fact that she had beaten him as often as he had beaten her, and that he had to play the best he had in him to hold the board against her. And he had not been prepared, most of all, for her fairness. She could have blackened him. The county was full of people who would have been glad to hear a Wickmere confirm every old story about the Fenwood cheat, and she was a Wickmere with every motive of inheritance to confirm them, and she did not. He heard of it sideways, the way one hears such things. The vicar's wife, fishing, had said something to Miss Wickmere about the old scandal, the famous Fenwood dishonour, expecting the heiress of the wronged house to feed the fire. And Miss Wickmere had said, coolly, that she knew nothing to the Duke's discredit, but the verdict of a suit 40 years old, that she had found him in their dealings scrupulously fair, and that she would thank the county to remember that a man was not his grandfather. She had defended him. To a gossip, on principle, when everything she had been taught and everything she stood to inherit told her to do the opposite. He revised a belief, then, alone in his library, at some cost to a pride that had armoured itself for years, in the conviction that the Wickmeres were beneath him. He had thought her his enemy's spiteful granddaughter. She was, he was beginning to see, the most honourable adversary he had ever faced, and the most worth the facing, and the fact that he was bound to marry her had stopped feeling, somewhere in the 3rd week of the snow, like a sentence. It was Mr. Hatch who would not let the thaw alone. He came often to East Cross that winter, the smooth grey solicitor on the business of the Red Rawn settlement, and he watched the two of them with his unsmiling smile. And he did what such men do, which was to feed the fire he lived by, carefully, a handful at a time, so that no single act could be pointed to. To the Duke, in private, over the settlement papers, he was all sober counsel. He hoped his Grace would not let a few weeks' civility and a clever woman's company soften a judgment 40 years in the forming. He reminded his Grace, delicately, that the redrawn terms gave away a great deal, that the original suit had all but established the Fenwood right to Danes Common, that a duke had a duty to his own posterity that came before a passing kindness to a pretty opponent. He let fall, as if reluctantly, that there were those who said the Wickmere girl was playing a deep game of her own, that a penniless heiress who could not refuse a duke might well decide to charm one instead, that her sudden fairness might be the cleverest move on the board. He did it beautifully. He did it so that the Duke could not quite be angry without seeming to confirm it. And to Verity, separately, he was all sympathy. He found her in the library one grey afternoon, and condoled with her, smoothly, on the hard position of a lady married for a treaty, and hoped she did not let the Duke's careful manners blind her to the plain facts. The plain fact, above all, that whatever was signed this winter, the world would always know the Fenwoods for what they were, that a name once stained did not come clean, and that she would spend her life as the wife of the house everyone whispered of, her own good Wickmere name swallowed into a dishonour not of her making. He had a letter, he said, an old letter that bore on the original quarrel. He would not trouble her with it now. But she should know that the truth of the old business was perhaps darker than even her family had been told, and that it touched the Fenwoods nearer than they liked. He let the hint hang. He gathered his papers and bowed and left it hanging. A small, barbed thing lodged under her ribs, exactly as he had meant it to lodge. She did not know then what the letter was. She knew only that Mr. Jocelyn Hatch wanted her to distrust the Duke, and that a man so anxious to keep two people enemies was a man who had something to lose by their peace, and she filed it away in the cold, clear part of her mind that had won her so many games, against a use she could not yet see. The thaw, despite him, went on. It went on in small, unannounced concessions, the way the articles of any real peace are written, one quiet clause at a time. She left him a book. She had found, in the East Cross Library, a treatise on the openings. An old Italian master, annotated in a hand she did not know, and she had seen the Duke reach for it once and stop himself, as though the chess they played was a thing too charged to study openly, and so she had marked a page and left it on his table without a word. The page where the author argued that a gambit freely offered was not weakness, but a question, that to give up a piece was sometimes the strongest move on the board. She left it and said nothing. The next night he had read it. She could tell, and he said nothing either, and played her a gambit she had not seen him play before, offered a knight as a question, and the not-saying was louder than any speech. He, in his turn, gave her back a thing she had thought lost. Among the old papers of the suit, he told her one evening, set down without ceremony beside the board, the original lawyers had impounded, 2 generations ago, a quantity of the Wickmere effects, and most had been sold or scattered, but one small thing had survived in a box of the firm's, and he had had it sent for, and here it was. It was a chess piece. A white queen, ivory, worn the colour of old teeth, the lost queen from her father's set, the set she had carried wrapped in flannel on her knee, that had stood incomplete her whole life with a plain wooden replacement in the white queen's square, the original, taken in the wreck of her family 40 years before she was born. He had found it in the wreckage of the suit and given it back to her, quietly, expecting nothing, an enemy returning to the enemy, the one piece the war had stolen. She did not trust her voice for a moment. She set the old queen in her palm and looked at it, the worn ivory, her father's mended set made whole at last by the hand of the house that had broken it, and she understood that something had shifted in her that she would not be able to shift back. "Why?" she said, when she could. "Why give me this? You owe my house nothing. Your house has been told for 40 years that mine slandered yours. Why would you trouble to find a Wickmere chess piece in a box of old briefs and give it back to a woman who was raised to hate you?" And the Duke of Fenwood, who had held himself on parade his whole life, lowered his arms for the first time, in the one scene she alone would ever witness. "Because I am tired," he said. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire. "I am tired of being a name people lower their voices around. I am tired of a silence I was handed as a boy and forbidden to question, of guarding a thing I do not even fully understand, of being the keeper of a dishonor no one will explain to me. My grandfather was called a cheat and never answered it, and my father kept the silence, and I have kept it, and I do not know to this day what it is I am keeping. I only know that the Wickmeres hate us for it, and that I was taught to hate them back, and that I have sat across a chessboard from you for 3 weeks, and found you the most honourable adversary I have ever met. And I am tired, Miss Wickmere, past saying, of being the enemy of the one person in 40 years who has looked at my name and troubled to see the man under it. I gave you the Queen because it was yours. There is no deeper reason. I am weary of deeper reasons. I should like, just once, to do a plain fair thing for a Wickmere, and not have it be a move. The room was very still. The fire spoke. The great-aunt, who was not as asleep as she pretended, kept her eyes shut and her counsel. And Verity Wickmere, holding her father's Queen, found that she too was tired of the war, and did the thing she had not done in front of any living soul since her father died, which was to lower her own arms in the one scene he alone would ever witness. "I will tell you what chess is to me," she said, "since we are being honest, which I had not expected to be, in this house, with you. It is the only thing my father left me that the creditors could not take, because they did not know it was worth anything. He taught me on that set, the one your firm broke up, and you have just made whole. He was a disgraced man, and a poor one, and not, I think, by the end, an entirely honest one, for he died owing money he had no right to have borrowed, and I loved him past all sense, and the one clean thing between us was the board. When he was gone, I went on playing, because it was the one place left where I was not a poor woman, or a plain one, or a clever one the world had no use for. It was the one place where I was simply the better player, and could not be argued out of it, or married out of it, or pitied out of it. That is why I made the oath. Not as a joke. It was the truest thing I have ever said, dressed up as a joke so that I could bear to say it. I said I would marry the man who beat me at chess, because I meant I would belong to no one who could not meet me as I am, and I did not believe such a man existed, and I had made my peace with belonging to no one. She set the Queen down on its square, the set made whole. And then you asked for the board, and you beat me. And I have been frightened ever since, not of losing. I have never minded losing fairly, but of how little I minded it being you. Neither of them moved. It was the nearest thing to a declaration either had made, and it had been made over a chessboard in an enemy's house, with an old woman pretending to sleep by the fire, and it hung in the warm air of the one warm room, and neither of them reached for it, because to reach for it was to cross a line drawn 2 generations before they were born, and they were both still too proud and too bound and too uncertain of the ground to cross it yet. "Verity," he said. It was the first time. Her given name, in his flat, correct voice, gone suddenly unsteady at the end of it. "Arthur," she said, and gave him his back, and the using of the names was the whole of what they let themselves have that night, and it was a great deal. It could not last, of course. Mr. Hatch had a letter, and a winter's careful work, and a living to protect, and he had been waiting only for the moment when the thaw was far enough advanced that breaking it would hurt the most. He chose the night of the county assembly. The settlement was nearly drawn. The term was nearly up. The county, which had watched the betrothal residence with the avid curiosity of people who had traded in the Fenwood scandal for 40 years, and now found their currency reconciled out from under them, had got up an assembly at the market town, the first great gathering of the winter, and the 2 houses were to appear at it together, publicly, the long feud laid visibly to rest before the whole of the neighborhood. It was to be the seal on the peace. Hatch made it the occasion of the war's last and worst battle. He did it with the letter, and he did it in the cruelest possible way, which was to make it look like kindness. He came to Verity in the card room, away from the dancing, smooth and grey and grave, and he told her that his conscience would not let her go to the altar in ignorance, that she had a right to the truth before she bound her name and her honour to the house of Fenwood forever. And he gave her the letter. It was old, the ink browned, the seal her own family's broken seal, and it was in the hand of her own grandfather, the cheated, disgraced grandfather of the Wickmere Catechism, and it was addressed to the Duke's grandfather, and what it said, in the few lines Hatch let her read by the card-room candles, stopped her breath. It thanked the Fenwood grandfather. It thanked him, in her own grandfather's hand, for taking the blame, for shielding her, for letting the world believe the Fenwood guilty, so that the Wickmere children need never know the truth. "You see, Miss Wickmere," said Mr. Hatch gently, watching her face, "the old story your family was told, that the Fenwoods cheated you, was a lie. But it was not the lie you will be wanting to think. The Fenwoods did not cheat your grandfather. Your grandfather ruined himself, and ruined the joint trust, and the charity money with it, the tenants' money, the poor's money, gambled and lost and embezzled by his own hand, and the Fenwood Duke, who loved your grandmother, and could not bear to see her children grow up the children of a thief, took the whole disgrace upon his own name to spare them. He let himself be called the cheat. He paid the debts your grandfather could not. He bought the silence of every man who knew, my own father among them, and he died with the stain on him that should have been on your house, to protect a woman and her children. And the thanks he got, Miss Wickmere, the thanks your family gave him for ruining itself to save your name, was 40 years of slander. That is the truth of the great Fenwood dishonour. There was no Fenwood dishonour. There was only a Fenwood kindness and a Wickmere crime, and a great many years of your family, spitting on the grave of the man who beggared himself to keep your grandfather's sin off your back. The card-room was warm and bright and far away. Verity stood, holding the letter, and felt the whole architecture of her life come down, quietly, one wall at a time. Everything she had been taught, everything she had inherited, the grievance she had nursed, the wall she had built, the very hatred she had been so carefully, slowly laying down these last weeks, was founded on a lie, and the lie was not the enemy's. It was her own grandfather, the thief, her own family, the slanderers, the Fenwoods, whom she had been raised to despise, the secret saviours of the Wickmere name, repaid in spite for 2 generations. She understood, in the same instant, why Hatch had given it to her, and why now, and the understanding was almost worse than the truth. He had not given it to her to free her. He had given it to her to break her, and to break the peace, on the night it was to be sealed. Because a married duke and a contented duchess do not pay a solicitor 40 years of fees, and a man whose own father had drawn the silent bargain and skimmed the silence, a man whose whole living and whole importance was the keeping of this lie and the feeding of this war, would rather burn the both of them down than let the suit, his life, end in a quiet wedding. "Does the Duke know?" she heard herself ask. "This, the truth of it. Does Arthur know?" And Mr. Hatch smiled at last, fully, the smile reaching his eyes for the first time all winter, because he had been waiting for exactly that question. "No," he said. "His Grace knows only the silence, as you heard him say yourself, that he keeps a dishonor he does not understand. He does not know his grandfather was innocent. He does not know your grandfather was guilty. He does not know that the woman he is about to marry is the granddaughter of the thief whose crime stained his house for 40 years. He took the letter back from her unresisting hand, gently, and folded it away. "It is yours to tell him, of course, or not. I only thought you should not go to the altar without knowing whose blood you carry, and whose name you owe more to than your own. Shall I see you back to the dancing? You have gone quite pale." She did not go back to the dancing. She found the Duke, and she found her great-aunt, and the truth came out that night, all of it, not in the card-room, but in the cold antechamber where Hortense had drawn them when she saw Verity's face, and it came out badly, jaggedly, the worst battle of the whole long war, fought not between the two houses at all, but inside the wreckage of two people who had almost laid the war down. For there was a moment, a black moment, when it nearly broke them. When Verity, white and shaking, told the Duke what she had learned, the thief's granddaughter's shame of it roar in her voice, and the Duke heard, for the first time in his life, that his grandfather had been innocent, that the silence he had kept and hated had been a kindness, that the house he had carried like a cross had been clean all along, and that the woman in front of him was the granddaughter of the man whose crime had cost the Fenwoods 40 years of cold drawing rooms. And for one moment, one terrible inherited moment, the old catechism rose up in him, the 40 years of being the enemy of her name, and his face closed, and Verity saw it close, and thought, "There, that is the end. That is the wall coming back up. He has every right," and braced herself to lose the one thing the winter had given her. But it was the great-aunt who broke the moment, the elder who remembered, the one who had carried the truth across both houses for 50 years, and waited, with the terrible patience of the old, for the hour to set it down. "Sit down, both of you," said Hortense Bowthorpe, "and listen to an old woman who has known the whole of this since before either of you drew breath, and has held her tongue because a vow was a vow, and the dead were owed their silence, and who is about to break it at last, because the living are owed more." And she told them. She had been a girl in both houses when it happened. She had loved them both, the Wickmere who fell, and the Fenwood who caught him. She told them how the trust had failed, how the poor's money had gone, how the Wickmere grandfather had come to the Fenwood grandfather, not as an enemy, but as the dearest friend of his youth, ruined and desperate and ashamed, with a wife and small children who would carry the thief's name forever. And how the Fenwood Duke, who had loved the Wickmere wife since before either was married and loved her still in the clean, hopeless way of an honourable man, had said simply, "Let it be me. Let the world say I did it. Your children will grow up clean." And he had taken the disgrace, and paid what could be paid, and never spoken of it. And the only thanks he ever asked was the silence. And the silence had curdled, in the second generation, into the slander he had foreseen and accepted as the price. And he had died, Hortense said, her old voice steady, with the lie on him, and the truth in his heart. And he had told her once, near the end, that he did not regret it, that he would do it again, that a name was a small thing to give for the children of the woman he loved, and that the only thing he asked of God was that someday, when it could hurt no one living, the two houses might come to peace, and never know the cost of it, or know it, and forgive each other the long, stupid years. He did not want you to know, Hortense said, looking at Verity. That was the whole of his kindness, that you should never know your grandfather was a thief. And he did not want you to know, looking at Arthur, that your grandfather was the better man, because he did not think himself the better man. He thought himself only a man in love, doing the one thing love left him to do. They are both 40 years dead, the thief and the saint, and they died unreconciled in the eyes of the world, and entirely reconciled in their own hearts. And the only people who profited from keeping it secret after they were gone were the lawyers, who have billed 2 estates into the ground for 40 years to litigate a quarrel that 2 old men settled between themselves, in love and in honor, before either of you was born. And there it was, the thing that dissolved the war, not a victory of one house over the other, but a third truth that made the whole war a tragedy of ignorance, that left neither side the villain and neither side the wronged. Only 2 dead men who had loved each other, and a woman, and 2 living houses who had been taught to hate across the grave of a kindness. Mr. Jocelyn Hatch was not at the assembly when they went to find him. He had gone, the servants said, directly after speaking with Miss Wickmere. He had called for his shares and gone. But the truth, once spoken, has a way of pulling the rest of the threads. And within the week the whole of it had unravelled. The firm's old papers opened at last with the Duke's authority, the silent bargain found where Hatch's father had filed it, the skimmed money traced, the 40 years of fees that had been billed to litigate a settled quarrel laid bare for what they were. Hatch had kept the suit alive because the suit was his living, and the lie was his inheritance, his father's crime and his own, and peace between the houses would have exposed both. He did not fight it in the end. There was nothing to fight it with. He was an old man whose whole importance in the world had been the keeping of one war. And when the war ended, he simply went to a married daughter in another county, and was not heard of again. And the strange thing, the thing Verity could not have predicted, was that she pitied him. He had been the villain of the whole piece, and his defeat was the saddest part of it. An old man who had given his life to feeding a fire, and was left, at the end, with nothing but the cold of it. No fortune, no name, no fire to warm his hands at, only the long memory of a war that had been, all along, a lie that 2 better men had told out of love. The truth was out. The houses were clean of each other. And there remained, between Verity Wickmere and Arthur, Duke of Fenwood, the question of what 2 people do when the war they were raised in turns out never to have been their war at all. It was harder than it should have been. That was the thing neither of them had foreseen. They had spent the winter laying down the feud a clause at a time. And now the feud was simply gone, dissolved, and they found themselves standing in the cleared ground of it, with no war left to fight, and nothing yet built in its place, and all the old pride still in them, and the new knowledge between them, like a third presence in every room. For now, Verity knew herself the granddaughter of the thief whose crime had stained his house, and the knowledge sat on her like a debt she could never pay. And her pride, The pride that had been her armor her whole life could not bear to come to him as a supplicant, the guilty house seeking the wronged. And he knew himself now, the heir not of a cheat, but of a man who had given everything for love and asked nothing, and his own pride could not bear to claim, out of his grandfather's old sacrifice, the granddaughter of the man his grandfather had shielded, as though the kindness of 40 years ago were a bill at last come due. To marry now looked from either side like a settling of accounts. And they had both had, the both of them, a lifetime's surfeit of accounts. So the question of the marriage came back to the settlement table, where it had begun, and it was there, on the last day of the winter term, that the Duke did the thing that ended it. The redrawn settlement lay between them on the long table, fairly drawn at last, the lawyers gone, only the Duke and Verity and the great-aunt in the cold, bright morning room. And a new fact in the room that changed everything, which was that the truth, now known, had changed the law. For with the old fraud exposed, and the trust's true history proved, the contested ground at Danes Common, the 40 years' battlefield, was no longer doubtful at all. It was the Duke's. The Fenwood grandfather had paid the debts on it. The Fenwood house had the better title. Any court in England, now the truth was out, would confirm it in an hour. Arthur, Duke of Fenwood, had only to press it, and the long war would end at last in the total vindication of his house, the contested acres his, the stained name cleared, the wronged family wronged no longer, and the granddaughter of the thief left with her one small mortgaged estate and the knowledge of her grandfather's crime, and nothing else in the world. The county expected it. The law invited it. It was his, fairly and at last, everything his house had been cheated of in the world's eyes for 40 years, handed to him by the truth. He took up the pen. Verity watched him, and held herself very straight, and prepared to lose, as she had been prepared to lose all her life, with dignity and without begging, because begging was the one thing the Wickmere pride had left her, and she would not spend it even now. The Duke did not sign the deed that gave him the common. He drew the other paper to him instead, the one his solicitor had drawn weeks ago, and he had never used. And he signed, in his flat, correct hand, a quitclaim, a full and unconditional surrender of the Fenwood interest in Danes Common to the House of Wickmere, in perpetuity, and beneath it a withdrawal of the whole ancient suit, and beneath that a discharge of the betrothal, releasing Miss Verity Wickmere from any obligation to the marriage. And he blotted it, and he turned it, and he slid it down the long table to her, the deed sliding across the polished wood, the way a chess piece slides, with no word at all, which was the loudest thing he had ever said. "Your Grace," she began. "The common is yours," he said. "It was your house's before my grandfather paid its debts, and my grandfather paid them to spare your family, not to take their land. And I will not be the Fenwood who turns his kindness into a conquest at the end of 40 years. He gave up his name to keep your house whole. I will not undo it by taking your last field the moment the truth lets me. The suit is withdrawn. The common is Wickmere ground, fenced by neither house, exactly as I said it should be on the first day, before I knew you, when fairness was only a principle, and not yet a person." He set down the pen. "And you are free. The marriage was a treaty between houses that no longer have a quarrel to treat over, and a treaty without a war is nothing. And I will not hold you to a wedding arranged to end a feud that ended itself in a card room a fortnight ago. You owe Fenwood nothing. You never did. The debt was always the other way, and your grandfather knew it, and mine forgave it, and I will not be the one to call it in. Holmlea is yours. The common is yours. Your name is clean, whatever the old papers say, because no living soul will hear the truth of your grandfather from me. That silence, at least, I will keep, as my house has always kept it, gladly. You are free, Verity. Go home. Be the mistress of your own ground. I ask nothing. I am only sorry, more sorry than I can say in a morning room with my great-aunt listening, that I did not meet you in some other life, where there was no war between us to lay down. And I might have courted you honestly, as a man courts a woman, and asked for the board because I wanted to play you, and not because you had flung an oath at a dinner table to make the lot of us ashamed of ourselves. He stood. He bowed to her, exactly as deeply as her rank required, no longer 1 inch shallower, and he left her the deed, and the cleared ground, and the open door, and turned to go, and asked her, with that, for nothing at all. It was the concession entire. He had yielded the disputed thing, all of it, the land, and the suit, and the marriage, and her, expecting nothing, refusing the victory the truth had handed him, because to take it would be to spoil the one clean thing his grandfather had done. And the hinge of the whole long winter now was her answer. She let him reach the door. "Sit down, Your Grace," said Verity Wickmere. He stopped. "You have made," she said, "a very generous move, the most generous I have seen on any board. You have given up your whole position, the win in your hand, expecting nothing. And you have done it so that I might be free, which is the kindest thing anyone has done me since my father died. And I find I cannot accept it, for the same reason you could not take the common, because it leaves the accounts unequal. You have lowered your arms entirely, and asked me to keep mine raised, and I will not have a peace on those terms any more than I would have a war on them. You said it yourself the first day, in front of that dreadful man. An unequal peace is only a war that has not finished. So sit down. We are not finished." She crossed to the long table, and she took up from beside it the box she had carried into the room that morning, and set down without explanation. And she unwrapped it, the flannel falling away, and she set out on the polished wood between them. Her father's chessmen, ivory and ebony, the white pieces gone the colour of old teeth, the lost queen restored to her square, the set made whole by his hand, and she sat down on her side of it and looked up at him. "You asked for the board once," she said, "at a dinner, to answer an oath made in anger. And you beat me, and then you handed me the win back unenforced, because you would not have me by a trick. I have thought about that more than I have thought about anything else this winter. So I am asking for the board now, not to settle a feud, which is over, not to enforce an oath, which I withdraw. I will not marry the first man who beats me at chess. I was a fool to say it. No game should decide a life. I am asking you to play me for nothing. No houses, no oath, no suit, no debt of one grandfather to another. Just a woman who has at last met her equal across a board, and a man who refused to win her when he could have, sitting down to play because they both want to, as we have wanted to every night of this winter, and never once let ourselves say, 'Sit down and play me, Arthur.' And whoever wins or loses or draws, when the game is over, I am going to ask you to marry me, of my own free will, the guilty house to the clean one, because I choose you, not because anyone won. That is my concession. I will not be given my freedom, and keep it. I would rather spend it on you." The Duke of Fenwood came back from the door. He sat down on his side of her father's board, in the cold, bright morning room, with his great-aunt at last not pretending to sleep, but watching openly, her old eyes wet, and her paring-knife tongue, for once, entirely still. He looked at the board, the worn ivory set, the war's last field reduced to its true size at last, 64 squares between two equals. He looked up at Verity Wickmere, and the Duke of Fenwood, who had held himself on parade his whole life, smiled at last the whole of a smile, the one she had been catching the almost of all winter. "White or black, Miss Wickmere?" he said. "Black," she said. "You go first. You always have. I find, on the whole, that I have not minded." They played. It was the best game either of them ever played, and the longest, and the great-aunt fell genuinely asleep before the end of it, and it came down at last, past noon, to a bare board, a king and a pawn against a king, a position that anyone who knew the game could see was drawn dead level, neither able to beat the other. Two kings on an empty field, with nothing left to fight over. And Verity looked at the drawn board, the perfect equality of it, and reached across her father's set, and offered her hand, not to tip a king, but to take his, and the Duke of Fenwood took it, the guilty house and the clean one meeting at last in the middle of the cleared ground. And that was the whole of their wedding, really, though there was a proper one later. The rest was only paper. They were married in the spring, at the small church between the two estates, with the whole county there to see the long war end, and the county told the story for years afterward. The Duke and the chess-playing heiress, the feud mended by a wedding, and the county told it wrong, because the county never knew the truth, which was the way both grandfathers would have wanted it. The story they told was of an old quarrel laid down. The truth was of an old kindness, finally, after 40 years, allowed to do its work. It was not a peace without cost. They never pretended it was. The years the suit had eaten did not come back. Both houses were poorer for them, and would be for a generation, the great parks unswept, and the fountains slow to run again. Verity's grandfather lay in the Holmlayer vault, a thief, and Arthur's grandfather lay in the Fenwood vault, a saint the world still believed a cheat, the two of them unreconciled forever in the eyes of a county that would never be told, and that injustice could not now be undone, and they did not try to undo it. They let the two old men keep their secret, the crime and the kindness both, because that was the bargain those two had made, and it was not the living's to break. And Mr. Jocelyn Hatch, the man who had fed the fire for 40 years, ended his days a pensioner in his daughter's spare room, with nothing to show for a lifetime but the cold of an extinguished war. And Verity, who might have been forgiven for hating him, found that she could not, that there was nothing in him to hate, only an old man who had built his whole self out of other people's quarrel, and been left with nothing when the quarrel ended, which is its own kind of poverty, and the saddest in the story. But Danes Common was Wickmere ground now, fenced by neither house, and the tenants of both estates grazed it in common, as their great-grandfathers had before the lawyers came, and that was the disputed thing transformed, the 40 years' battlefield become at last simply a field, where children from both houses learned to walk, and in the long evenings at East Cross in the one warm room. There was a board between them still, her father's set, ivory and ebony, the lost queen home in her square. And they played most nights, hard, fair, no quarter. The Duke and the Duchess of the joined houses, two equals who had each beaten the other, and been beaten in turn, and had stopped, long ago, keeping the score, because the score had never been the point. In two houses, on a grey morning years before, two people had been told the war was over, and had not believed it. They believed it now. It was over. It had been a lie from the start, and the truth had ended it, and what was left when the lie burned away was the thing the lie had been hiding all along, which was that the two houses had never truly been enemies, only strangers kept apart by a kindness too large to speak of, and that all it had ever needed to mend 40 years was for two proud people to sit down at last across a board and meet as equals and play. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.